Welcome to The Detox, Lyman Health Podcast. And now, the man that simplifies the complex, your host, Dr. Jay Davidson.
I'm with Dr. Scott Richmond today, good friend, colleague. He is trained DC. He's also got his PSCD license, which is a doctorate of pastoral medicine and science. He's got over 13 years of experience working with patients from all different ages. He received his Bachelor's of Arts from Buena Vista University with a degree in athletic training after having a season-ending injury in baseball. That put him on the path of going to chiropractic school, where he graduated in 2005, which is crazy to think about. That's 13 years ago. Dr. Richmond began learning more about integrative nutrition when he became very ill while living in a home with toxic mold. After being diagnosed with mold toxicity, MCS, otherwise known as multiple chemical sensitivity, chronic Lyme disease, hypothyroid, heavy metal toxicity, and a multitude of other health issues, he was finally able to get to the root cause of the problem and is living happier and healthier than ever. After many years of healing, hospitalizations, and further education, Dr. Richmond feels compelled and motivated in engaging with clients all around the world in their journey to healing. I'd like to say that Dr. Scott is definitely known as the people's champion for his ability to advocate for others and inspire them to take action. He's a passionate communicator with strong and immediate connections. Dr. Scott uses expression in his language in a way that he shares with others. He instinctively connects quickly and easily, also motivates others. You can find more about him on our website, drjdavidson.com/about. Dr. Scott Richmond, welcome to the podcast today.
Dr. Jay, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I love to interview Dr. Scott. Fortunately, you've had some life circumstances that have put you in the expert realm of many things in what we'd call maybe functional nutrition or functional medicine. One of those is mold. Can you give us a little background, just, I guess, maybe a summary of how did you get into the mold space and where you're at today?
Yeah, so in 2007, just doing some chiropractic training and learning about nutrition and detoxification, I started hearing this word, biotoxic illness and really what that meant. And 2008, fast forward, I found myself, I'd been living in a moldy home, didn't really know it. And I'd did some work in my basement, just kind of cleaning things up. I'd been living there for about 2.5 years. And, that summer I just started noticing I was having some health challenges that I never, had before, specifically allergies. And, that fall, my daughter was born. She started having a rash, systemically. She was very colicky, a lot of GI issues, and just everything kind of started snowballing. And, come the beginning of the next year, so this is 2008, I started realizing how sick I really was. I mean, if you look up all the commonality of the symptoms that would be in the, mold illness space, I checked off every single one of them. And we're talking like an 11 by 18 sheet, just full of symptoms. And I literally, every single one of them I was dealing with on one level or another, some more, severe than the other ones, but really started off with a lot of GI issues, the light sensitivity, the headaches. And then one of them too that was really alarming was the severe nosebleeds, like intermittent nosebleeds that I'd never ever dealt with before. And then along came like the severe insomnia. So the good news, fortunately, is the fact that I had heard that term biotoxic illness and mold illness prior to this. And so I felt fortunate to know probably what I was dealing with. Unfortunately, I didn't see mold in my house. I didn't know the testing. I didn't know what to do on that front, but 2 and 2 equals 4, which is what I was taught. And many of us know that is I had a wet basement. There's building material. There's indication of water damage. And the house was completely shut up for 5 months because I live in Iowa and it's very cold and snowy at that time of the year. So there's heat. Well, all of those things added together just is a breeding ground to deal with the mold. And I think maybe, somewhere along our conversations, we've talked about this maybe once before. And another alarming factor after 6 months that I had lived in that house is our neighbors so kindly informed us about the previous owner, who their son, he was in his early 20s, actually lived in that house. And we found out after the fact that he actually had killed himself. He committed suicide in the garage. So they didn't have to disclose it because it was a detached garage. So we didn't know this had happened. And, of course, he was a different personality. He was outside doing weird things, taking care of the lawn at weird hours of the day, you name it. And it was really apparent to me, based on the way that this house was affecting me and what I was experiencing at that time, it all added up. He was very, very sick, and he was mold poisoned. He definitely was dealing with the same thing, because I went from sanity to massive irritability. I couldn't tolerate sounds. I couldn't tolerate light. It was the ups and the downs, the mood swings. I mean, like it didn't feel anything like myself. And so with somebody who maybe was experiencing that type of toxicity illness and really not having a clue about it, it really explained to me maybe why, he ended up doing what he did. And the sad reality is probably still to this day, his family doesn't even understand that, which is why I'm definitely on the mission. And with the things that are even happening today with the flooding and the hurricanes and all of that, this is a massive, massive epidemic that unfortunately every single day somebody's dealing with it. And it's only seems like it's gotten worse, but we've gotten more awareness too. So that's really the mission behind all this, and telling my story. Others that have very similar stories, they all sound a lot alike. How we've navigated it or how it's affected us maybe is where some of the differences are, but the commonalities are all too common, unfortunately. So that's really where this began for me back in 2008, which is actually when I met you and Dr. Heather too, just starting the journey of unraveling what I now know today. It goes much deeper than even the mold, but that's really the final piece that drove me to having to dig deeper into all this through the challenges that I faced and my family faced, my daughter, to where I'm at today.
Yeah, it's amazing the journey we've all had, and how now we're on the same team and really just working to get people better. So where there's pain, there's purpose. Where there's mess, there's a message. Testimony. So you mentioned nosebleeds. Are nosebleeds most commonly tied with mold? Are there any other things that you've seen tied with nosebleeds?
I mean, there can be all kinds of things. I mean, the small blood vessels, capillaries, whether there's, even like an anemia or deficiency types of things, absolutely could lead to that. But I started having sinus issues. I started having, I couldn't mow my lawn without sneezing all the time. The allergies, the insensitivity, and intolerance for environmental factors is what I noticed changing. Which now I understand too. It was because I was already having gut issues. And so that was my first line, barrier to the immune system, the inflammatory response that happens. And then mold, like I said, it was just more gasoline on the fire that the foundation of the problem was already laid. And then it just kept getting worse and worse. And it wasn't like that house made me sick from day one. I'm not in what we call the dreaded genotype. Top 3% of individuals that are unable to deal with this type of an environmental toxin. I'm more in the higher end of the 24 percentile. So it's definitely going to make me sick. I'm definitely genetically susceptible, but I'm not dreaded genotype. And so I could tolerate it for a while, which about for 2.5 years I did, but my bucket was getting more and more full. And then, now the stress of a new child coming in, and then when she was finally born, now sleep deprivation and everything that comes along with a new child was really the final trigger of all that, and that expression of the inability to clear those toxins that my body had been storing in fat cells and protecting me. Now all of a sudden the floodgates start opening up, and the inflammatory response was just off the charts, which is why all the symptoms started coming along the way that they did.
I find nosebleeds, mold. It seems as if somebody has sensitivities, reactions. They're they just seem to react to everything. Mold tends to be thrown into that. Is that one of the top things that you see for those hypersensitive type people?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, like I said, I've seen a myriad of symptoms for sure. The sinus issues, the bleeding, affecting the eyes. We see that a lot with the light sensitivity. Neurological inflammation, right? Brain inflammation is one of the big things that I'll see, associated with the exposure. And I mean, it's just the massive inflammation response that the body has that really is the underlying causative factor of so many symptoms that are associated with mold illness.
So for those listening to the podcast and you're like, hey, I just want to improve my health, we usually recommend just starting, go to microbeformulas.com. There's a protocol guide. It's a great place just to begin the journey. For those that are struggling with health and you're like, I need to go to the next level, there's an at-home program that I put together. It is do it at your own pace and on your own, and depending on your inspiration and motivation, might be a great thing, might not be a great thing. And then I would say the ultimate thing is really one-on-one coaching. And Dr. Scott Richmond, Dr. Nick Ellenson on our team, they're the primary two doctors that really work with clients one-on-one. Obviously, I'm speaking right now with Dr. Scott Richmond. And I believe that nothing replaces one-on-one coaching. What's your thoughts about, and I want to dive into mold in depth. I want to talk about mold spores and mycotoxins. I've actually got an ERMI test. I haven't told you that yet. I've got an ERMI test I want to pull up and, kind of have you decipher for the audience as well. But just speaking about like one-on-one coaching, where do you see that being valuable for somebody in health restoration?
I mean, really, our job is to help you see blind spots. Recognizing trends and commonalities, and maybe, hey, I added this one step into my daily regimen, and this was the outcome. Or maybe it's an increase in a symptom per se that for most people would be like, well, that's a bad thing, but it may very well be a good thing. And so that's one of the most common things that I hear is the change in the symptomatology, and how do we decipher that? Like I said, the missing pieces. How do we take some really good things that we know about, and maybe some other things that we haven't heard about, and marry it together, put all the puzzle pieces together? Because in my experience, and I know you would agree with this, is that it's never just one thing. And so how do we navigate that? And then another component too is just the emotional and mental mindset around how do you be successful with your protocol, or just overall daily lifestyle and the tasks at hand. That's where a coach comes in, is to maybe extract out of you more than what you could get out of your own self. That's the role of a coach, right? And to whether it's accountability or just guidance, through the challenges, and celebrating the wins too. I mean, it's all aspects. That's why the coaching is absolutely irreplaceable one-on-one.
I agree. And it's really just to try to speed it up, right? Like, I believe anybody can figure it out if they have enough drive and they spend enough time and resources on it. But obviously as coaches, the goal is to accelerate that and save you time and money with that. So getting into the mold side of it, how do we know if we have mold in our house? How do we know if we have mold in our place of work or our school? Maybe let's just stick with the house. I mean, Is it they're going to have symptoms? Is it we have to run a test? What are your thoughts?
Not necessarily. I mean, start with the basics is general home maintenance, inspection, looking at, is there a roof leak that you maybe didn't see or notice, making sure you're checking the rafters and all the insulation, just up in the attic space. Do you have a basement? Notoriously basements may smell, they may smell, musty, things like that. And just like my story is, you don't have to see mold for this to be affecting you. So that's where it's like, start off with the basic things of general maintenance, inspection, looking around the most notorious places, such as bathrooms, under the kitchen sink, any areas like foundation crack, making sure that drainage around the home on the outside is proper. The water is getting away from the home, especially if it's got a basement or a walkout where there's there's pressure from the ground. That's notorious for causing these types of water leaks and things like that into the home, for sure. Windowsills, that's another big one. HVAC systems, making sure that that's always properly cleaned. And then, the next step then, if there is an area or suspicion, or if maybe somebody in the home is actually having symptoms, all of those would be red flags to then go kind of to the, we'll call it tier 2 as far as investigating, which is getting more into the testing, which you mentioned, the ERMI. And that's kind of the first thing that I would do from a test to then decipher, is this an environment, if somebody is actually already having, health challenges and symptoms, is it an environment in which they can recover in? Or is it something to where maybe we need to go to the next level of they need proper remediation and or even actually getting out of that home and that living environment. So we don't want to just go jumping off the proverbial cliff and saying, oh, I just got to get rid of everything and there's no saving any of that, or I have to just automatically move out of my house. It's let's do a little bit of due diligence work to decipher at what level, because everybody is going to be affected a little bit different. Their tolerance is going to be different. But the main thing is working the best scenarios is finding out, is it a safe environment that somebody can at least recover in? And then we can work on cleaning it up. And that's really what matters. Can we make progress? Can we recover our health? And if not, then let's take the next necessary steps.
Let's say somebody has mold and their health is not doing well. They don't have a great tolerance to handle it. So does that mean that their environment has to be cleaner than somebody that's doing fine, that maybe is still susceptible to mold just like the other person, but because the other person's in a worse spot, they have to make sure the environment's even cleaner in order for them to raise up and get healthier?
Exactly. I mean, like in my scenario, I was very, very ill. My daughter had more of the allergy side of the effects of molds, and her mom really didn't show a lot of signs of much of anything. So 3 different individuals reacting to the same environment differently, so it is all relative. And that's what makes dealing with mold in the situation of an environment challenging, is because there's a lot of variables there. And one of those big variables is the individual themselves. How we genetically are able to deal with that environment really matters. And then, like you said, do we have to really focus on cleaning that environment even more, just because this, say somebody else isn't sick in that environment? I've seen this in the workplace a lot. Well, why are some individuals getting sick in that environment and others aren't? And so then it gets into, well, who's right, who's wrong? What testing is the right thing? And there's just no way, because it's not really necessarily well understood. And so when you're dealing with tax dollars and, municipalities and things like that, looking at a workplace, or an employer looking at a workplace, it's very costly to go through proper remediation and even the testing. And usually they're not even doing good testing. So to prove why that individual or that employee may be getting sick from it is definitely a challenge also. And so it's something that we want to make sure, through these conversations, that we really, express and reiterate that, an individual can absolutely be responding differently compared to the next person. So important things. What's the difference between, or really, like, what makes people sick from mold, or what about the mold is the problem? It's really the mycotoxins. So the biotoxin that the mold produces, otherwise known as mycotoxins, and each form of mold is going to give off their specific type of toxin. But in general, the mycotoxin is what's really causing our bodies to become sick, causing that inflammatory response to really occur. Now, there is a medical condition known as aspergillosis, which that gets into more of somebody's inhaled or even ingested, say, the actual mold spores, and now that has colonized in the body, usually in the lungs. Okay, so that's the aspergillosis side of it, when it's more of the infection, the mold spores that have now grown, where most people are dealing with the mycotoxic, biotoxic illness per se.
So the mold then produces a toxin, a biotoxin, which basically means living toxin. And that toxin is then what makes us sick and can affect us.
Yeah, it's their weapon of choice. That's how they fend off other molds. And so that's why it can be, the mold itself can be living inside a wall, under a floor. You can never see it, but yet it's still making you sick because it's the chemical, the toxin in the air that you're breathing. That's what's actually making us sick. Now, unfortunately for me, I unknowingly made the mistake that I went and disturbed that water damaged material, which I'm sure deeply embedded was the mold that I necessarily wouldn't have seen. I just saw the water damage, like maybe like an inch or so at the bottom of the drywall. Now the problem is that I've disturbed it. I start ripping it off. I disturb it. The mold spores love to travel around on dust. So we want to we want to make sure that we're dusting properly all the time and cleaning our environment. But that's how it gets stirred up. And so even if it's like, hey, well, the problem's down in the basement, that doesn't mean that on the third floor that the bedroom's not being affected, or somebody who's sleeping up there isn't affected, even if they never go in the basement, is because now those molds and the spores can also get disturbed and into the HVAC, but just that mycotoxic circulation throughout the entire environment can be enough to make that individual sick.
There's so many. I feel like we can have multiple podcasts on mold. We, recently published a article on mold, and just questions come in because it's a topic I feel like there's not a lot of great direction on, and it's not necessarily black and white. Would you agree with the mold black and white side?
Yeah, it's so far from black and white, which is why, we, you and myself and others deal with very complex, conditions and infections and things like that, and these biotoxic illnesses per se. And I think maybe I'm biased because of what I've lived through, but I do believe that this is probably one of the most complex scenarios, because we're not only dealing with the human body and what's going on in the inside, we're not having to look at every single thing on the outside in the environment, whether it's a car, a workplace, a school, the home, and then we're dealing with possessions. It's a very, very costly endeavor without real great testing. And I think almost even psychologically, one of the worst aspects is there's no, for individuals going through this challenge, there's no true good validation from governmental agencies. That's the other thing. The EPA standards are subpar. The testing, the OSHAs, all of that stuff that we get into, there's just no clear definition, like you said. And I think that's what makes it challenging. And more importantly, those of us that have unfortunately went through this is how we've learned. And it is about saving time and money, because there's definitely some missteps that people can have and have had that have cost them dearly financially and through also their time, but more importantly, their health. Okay. And that's where we come in. And I feel like, unfortunately, I went through this so that I can understand this to help more people, because it's not going away. Homes are being built tighter. Buildings are getting built taller. Just this morning, my wife let me know that they just installed a wireless access point about 20 feet from her desk, which that magnifies and amplifies the aggressiveness of molds through Wi-Fi and EMF exposure. And we know that there's a leaky roof in that building, and she notices it more of a sensitivity, but she's fine when she comes home. So it's everywhere. And I think that's really what makes the complexity of the matter just even worse. It's just not going away.
I agree. So I want to share my screen. For those that are listening on iTunes, you can jump over to drjdavidson.com, click on the podcast tab, and you can find Dr. Scott Richmond interview podcast about mold testing in ERMI, and watch the YouTube video to see this. Otherwise, we'll do our best to explain this verbally. So this is an ERMI test. I just randomly pulled one of my previous clients and their ERMI. I blocked their personal information out so nobody will know who this is or anything like that. But walk us through. You said there's no perfect test. From I feel as if our mindset, we want, like, what's the perfect test? Let me run that. And I want to know concretely. And you're basically saying there isn't. So walk me through, like, what is the ERMI and what are we kind of seeing, I guess, on this report?
Yeah, so ERMI stands for Environmental Relative Moldy Index, so ERMI. And what this is it's a dust test. Basically, you're collecting the dust so that any of those spores that we were mentioned, are attracted and carried on dust. We can use the sample cloth, collect that, and then basically it's doing a DNA microscopic type of an analysis to determine which mold species are present in that environment. So you can do it room by room. I definitely recommend this over air quality test. Most companies are doing maybe a half an hour, or if like you're having a home inspection, they might do a half an hour type of an air quality test. But the problem is that's a spot shot in time. I mean, you can open a door and skew those data results, because now you're getting outdoor mixing with the indoor, and really, 24 hours and above would be more appropriate to determine what's happening from an air quality standpoint in that environment. The problem is with that, it's not cheap. Okay, I mean, we're talking thousands and thousands of dollars of doing that type of testing. So first tier to start to look at, if you have any suspicions or you just want to know for your environment, that's why I recommend starting off with the test that we have here in front of us. So what we see here is, you have the first group and then the second group. Now, the first group has a lot more of what we would call or consider the more pathogenic species. Okay, and we see a lot of none detected, which is great.
And that's what the ND stands for.
Exactly. So that sum of the first group, is the 16, and then you see down below it's the 9.26. So overall, we take those two subcategories there, add them all together, and that's what gives us that score of the 7.20.
So for those that are listening, essentially there's a group 1, which is a lot longer, and then there's a group number 2, which is a little bit smaller. The group 1 tends to be more of like the pathogenic type mold, and then the group 2 is the more non-pathogenic. Is that somewhat correct?
More of the common, like so specifically like the cladosporidium. Those are common outdoor molds. Okay. So we see an ERMI test score here of 7.20, which if you plot that on the rest of the test, it actually shows us relativity compared to, United States homes. Okay. And so if we look at a 7.0, we're right in that 85 percentile, which is definitely elevated. So let's make one thing clear too, regardless if you are mold sensitive or genetically predisposed to having mold sensitivity issues, living in mold is not healthy for anybody. Okay. So if I look at this, just generally speaking, 85 percentile, this isn't a healthy environment really for anybody to be in long term. Okay. Now, if we go back to the actual mold species here, I'm looking at a couple of different things here, the big ones that pop out. And the first one always is I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to look at the Stachybotrys.
Stachybotrys?
Yeah. So we got that there, that it's showing 3. Okay. Ideally, we want to see 0. Excuse me. And the thing about Stachybotrys is this is not a normal mold. This is really a mutated mold from building material. Okay, it's only found on the inside. There's no outdoor Stachybotrys species that is ever in our environment. So we know this is a mutation. This is what's considered the true actual black mold that we talk about or hear about.
Okay.
Most people say black mold based on the color. Okay, but really it could be any other type or kind of species of mold and not necessarily Stachybotrys. So that's one thing to be very clear, that this is the true black mold that we're talking about. It is well known that it is linked to all kinds of health conditions, cancers, things like that. So that's the one thing I want to look at first.
And that's a number 3 on this test. So what, Is that bad then? And what numbers should you see?
Yeah, we want to see zero.
Zero.
Absolutely. Because this is not, as I was mentioning, this is not a normally found mold. It's a mutation only found because of wet, heated building material.
Okay.
Got a food source and it's mutation, and now that's going to grow in that indoor environment. Some of the other ones I want to look at is, we talked about aspergillosis. So some of these other, there's many species of aspergillus. Aspergillus niger, we see a 1 there. Okay, that's one to be aware of. But any of these, too high can absolutely, impose a health threat for sure.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of aspergillus species, I guess. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different aspergillus on this report.
Yeah. So those are the real big ones. I mean, really all of these play a factor for sure. And on this report, we don't see, too many too high. We have the
Wallemia here at the bottom.
Yeah, yep. Wallemia is definitely elevated on this report, which I would be paying attention to for sure. The Eucodium, that one, that's aspergillus, I believe. That's elevated in the 700s. The other ones, for most part in this lab look pretty good, but the cool part about this is how you score it is really what matters, and that gives us that overall score, right? So everything can look pretty good, but then now comes along, we have 3 spore counts of Stachybotrys, and once again, this isn't an absolute. It's a good estimate. You're not going to discover every single thing in every crook and cranny of the home, right? So we know that this is something, this would raise a red flag to me for, like I said, for anybody, but especially if it matches up with the history, the symptomatology. I'm always looking for those clues in any case that I read through, keeping potential mold exposure in the back of my mind. Sometimes it's very obvious, and then other times it's not the primary thing, but there is some potential issues with the environment that if down the road, maybe that individual is not responding, kind of typically to care, or they plateau. That's when we come back to that mold piece and go, let's dig into this a little bit further, because it may be playing a bigger factor now. Where other cases, like myself, I knew exactly what it was right from the get-go. Okay. But we classically want to see that ERMI. Everybody's going to be different, but down to that 2 to negative 1.5-ish, right there in that middle. But just because we had a safe ERMI test in that range still doesn't guarantee that mold illness client or patient can still get well in that environment either. And that's what makes this a challenge is everything can look great and they can still be getting affected and have health challenges from that exposure.
Yeah, I wish on this podcast I could just pin you down and be like, okay, here's question 1. What's the answer? Question 2. But a lot of what I'm hearing is it depends on the person, and where mold might not have been a factor early on, now it could be later, or vice versa, where it could have been earlier to trigger and then now it's not main standing. Do you see it go both directions? Yeah.
Or what happens if now all of a sudden I had a new, my home was fine, and now it's wintertime and I had a pipe burst. It's a dynamic living environment that changes all the time. And there's another variable in this scenario too that, can always come into play. Somebody may be recovering. They were truly a biotoxic mold illness client, and they're recovering. And the next thing you know, maybe they got into their friend's car that, was 20 years old, not thinking because they're doing well, and boom, they had a mold exposure and now they crash. Okay, so that's just one extreme example, but it's something that we all do every day, which is practically get into a vehicle, and so it can trigger that immune response again, maybe not to the severity. Like myself, I can go into a moldy hotel, which is notorious, pretty much everywhere you go, and I can feel the effects, but I don't get deathly ill, because I've really worked on cleaning up my system, cleaning up and teaching my immune system that this is okay. I'm not going to stay in this environment. You don't have to have this all out assault on my body, but it's an alarm system that tells me, hey, there's something going on here and you probably shouldn't be in this environment too long. Calm everything down, not overreact, and life goes on per se. But it's that chronic cycle that a lot of people are just living in, day in and day out, and despite their other efforts, that's why they're not recovering.
Yeah, and I will say personally, I've known you through your journey, and it's an amazing journey. I mean, you could write a book on your story. I mean, just if you could put a dollar amount on what you've personally spent on your own symptomatology and struggles, I guess, in the health side, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, all aspects of this entire journey, including, having to leave my practice for 6 months, all the hospital bills, insurance payments, out-of-pocket treatment over the last decade, it equals up to, close to $1 million.
Wow.
Out of pocket, well into a few $100,000s of dollars for sure. Plus, traveling out of state, there was no resources for me here. So, the closest would be about 2.5 hours away. And I would do that frequently. I've traveled 1,000 miles one way just to make sure that I'm getting some proper care and treatment to get me back on my feet, and then be able to do a lot of my, the things that I do at home, which is, when we coach and we work with clients, I love all those tools. I've been exposed to, high-end therapies and things like that. But the real benefit is how can we work to getting ourselves taken care of and learning the tools that are going to get us through and doing that sustainably and right there at home. And provided that we're living in a clean environment, which is priority number one, so that our efforts can be, efficient for sure. But that's the journey and the experience that has led me to understand that, we can really recover without having to necessarily travel all around the world, or the country for that matter, to get that type of care for sure. And so I think it's really brought clarity on that. And that's where, the coaching, like you mentioned before, it's saving time and money. I spent $3,400 in one day at a facility that touted themselves as the mold treatment place to go to. And needless to say, it wasn't a very good experience. It was a $3,400 in one day mistake. But looking back very quickly after that, I was in a city where there was the right help for me. This was right out of 9-day stint in the hospital. And so you can imagine, what did we just waste our money on? But then I ended up in the facility that in 2 weeks, I was able to walk out of and actually look like a fairly normal human being, just about 30 pounds lighter. And so I look at that mishap as a blessing. And now that I can teach and it's, have others hear that experience of what not to do and help guide them so that they can put all their efforts and, their financial, capabilities in the right places so that they can get the best outcome and the soonest, the quickest result.
Well, appreciate you bringing your expertise on today with mold. Of course, I'll have you back on to talk more mold stuff because it's a topic that you can't cover in just a short podcast, but I wanted to give an example. Appreciate you taking some time to go through the ERMI as well, Dr. Scott Richmond. Best website, you can go to our website, drjdavidson.com. If you want to do coaching with Dr. Scott Richmond, just reach out to us there. Otherwise, your other website is thrivehealthcenters.com. Is that correct?
That's correct.
thrivehealthcenters.com. So we'll make sure to link that up in the podcast. Dr. Richmond, appreciate your expertise, and we'll be talking to you soon on a future podcast.
Thank you so much, Dr. J.
Thank you for listening. If you found this podcast valuable, feel free to share with others. The information in this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please seek the advice of a healthcare professional before changing your health program or embarking on a new one. To find more information and additional resources, please visit us on drjdavidson.com. That's drjdavidson.com. That's drjaydavidson.com.